International Relations. We give a warm welcome to all our guests, especially the speakers, but also those who are here at GADI's office in Buenos Aires. We will be discussing today a very important matter of the international agendas. We all know more than 2 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. This was not an isolated action of aggression, but a part of a series of acts that started around 10 years ago. And this was a key event in terms of the stability of the international order and the respect of certain principles, such as the peaceful resolution of national borders. And I think today's meeting is very important because it will allow us to understand different perspectives that are not well understood in times. I think the Latin American perspective is different from the perspective of other regions, both among the elites and the population. We're mostly focused in terms of our relation with the international conflicts, with the conflict between the US and China. I think that's important to understand because of the presence of China in the regions, mostly economic, but also politically. I was a few weeks ago at Munich, at the Munich Security Conference, and I could see how important it is for European security, the conflict that's taking place now in Ukraine. And we don't understand that usually in Latin America. So it's very important for us to take the time and the effort to understand what is happening now in Europe and how that affects the international order. And I think it's also important, this dialogue, the format we're having today, the seminar, also for Europeans, Americans to understand the perspective of Latin American countries. So I want to congratulate Lila Roldan, Director of the Committee of Eurasian Affairs, the members of the committee. This, I think, is a very important initiative. It's not the first one. And it will allow to have a discussion, exchange of ideas, that I hope is one of the many actions that are necessary to construct a more stable, peaceful, and just international order. Lila?
Just a few words of welcome. Good morning and welcome, my friends that are going to join us today to share your views on this subject. Alexei, Alexander, Tatiana, and all of you. I'm especially grateful for you having accepted my invitation, our invitation. And so without further ado, we're going to begin this because I know you're very, very busy, all of you. So we'll try to keep our schedule. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco and Lila, for your words. Good morning, everybody. This is a special seminar organized by the Eurasian Affairs Committee. My name is Santiago, and it's a great honor for me to moderate this seminar. Thank you for joining us, both in person and online. Special thanks to our distinguished speakers today. Today, we are pleased to count on the presence of prominent scholars, experts, and thought leaders who will provide us with valuable insights into the current situation of this multifaceted conflict. There is the war in Ukraine, a war that marked its second anniversary just a few weeks ago in terms of the full-scale invasion, and 10 years, a decade, since war broke out between the Ukrainian central government and the Russian-backed separatist forces in the Donbas region. Each of our distinguished speakers today will have 20 minutes for their presentation. We kindly request you to respect the time given so that all of the speakers have the same amount of time to present. And for proper time management, I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left for the end of your presentation. As for the audience, I would like to encourage you to save your questions for the Q&A session that will take place after all speakers have finished their presentation, with the exception of our first two speakers, Alexei and Tatiana, who have to leave early. And for those who have joined us online, please do not forget to turn your microphones on in order to not to interrupt any of our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much again. And now let's get started with our first distinguished speaker. Name is Alexei Haran. Alexei is a professor of comparative politics at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, UKMA. He served as dean and organizer of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the reborn Kyiv Mohyla Academy from 1991 to 1993. He is the founding director of the UKMA School for Policy Analysis and the research director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Haran is a co-editor of several books and a frequent commentator in Ukrainian and international media. He has spent time as a political scientist at the front line nearby Mariupol, Luhansk, Avdiivka, and Donetsk Airport. Alexei, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Actually, I didn't want, to go into the reasons of this war, because I think the most important thing is what's going on right now. But because in the introduction, Russian-backed separatists were mentioned, I need to start from this. Ukraine was attacked in 2014. Ukraine was non-nuclear, and Ukraine was a non-bloc state. Basically, we were a neutral state before 2014, and Russia attacked, despite all the guarantees. Listen, it wasn't the conflict with Russian-backed separatists. This was the war with Russia, which started in 2014. If you are talking about Russian-backed separatists, you'd better to talk about criminal groups which are controlled by Russia from the very beginning, and Russia direct military intervention started in August 2014. In August 2014, Russia sent regular troops. So I'm sorry for reminding this, but I believe, especially now, when we have full-scale invasion of Russia, let's forget about this very term, Russia-backed separatists, because it's not correct to describe what's going on in Ukraine. So I'm sorry for my reaction, but I had to react. Now, I would like also repeat that it's not the war between NATO and Russia, between the West and Russia. It's not a proxy war. I think everybody who wanted to understand what happened already understand. Okay, if there would be additional question, I can elaborate on that. Let me come immediately to what's going on right now. The results of the 2023, there were many hopes for Ukrainian counteroffensive. The counteroffensive was successful on the sea, and basically we pushed Russian fleet back from Western Black Sea, and we were able to restore the export from Ukraine, especially grain export, which is so important for the countries of the global south. However, on the land line, it wasn't successful, and now Russia actually seized several important place of Avdiivka, and they tried to continue with this assault. What are the reasons for this? First of all, that Putin has preponderance and manpower, and he doesn't care about life of Russian soldiers. Okay, so he's just sending Russian soldiers to die en masse, but that gives them preponderance. And second, we do not have enough arms. You cannot defend yourself without arms, and simply we have lack, for example, artillery shell. That's why it's so important for us to continue to receive material and military support from the West. Again, it's not because, and we know that in general the West has much more resources than Russia, But the West appeared not to be ready for this type of war, because for decades they believe in peaceful coexistence with Russia, and that Russia would not attack, and Russia attacked. So unfortunately, here we see the problems. We see the problems also with American support. You know about what's going on in American Congress, so I will not go into details. I hope that finally it will be solved, but there is a delay, and delay led to the blood of Ukrainians on the battleground. At the same time, if we are talking about international situation, we received very important signals of support from Europe, from the European Union at the end of the year, on the start of negotiations on accession to the EU, and also financial support for Ukraine. Very, very important. 50 billion euros for 4 years. That's really important for us, and we appreciate it. We have, unfortunately, and it was possible to persuade even such, how to say it, skeptics. This is very diplomatic word, skeptics, as Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, new coming Prime Minister of Slovakia, Mr. Fico. They couldn't block this decision. So it gives me something, some positive background for the future of relations with the EU, though we know that there are problems even with such our strategic ally as Poland, and there are problems connected with control of export of agricultural production, which led to the blocking of the borders between Poland and Ukraine from Polish farmers, and this blocking include also supplies of weapons. I think we need to look at this situation in more broader context. So this is not only about Polish-Ukrainian relations in agriculture, this is also about EU agricultural policy in general, and we do not have doubts that the present Polish government is ready to solve the issue. It's difficult to do on the eve of local elections, but I hope that finally it will be solved, because anyway, Poland and Ukraine remain strategic partners. Now, let's move to domestic situation in Ukraine. First of all, Ukrainians do not lose confidence in themselves despite all the problems. By the way, when I would quote now the results of the polls conducted by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, respectable organization, and which is confirmed actually by different other polls, including from my organization, but Kyiv Institute of Sociology, they did the latest poll in February after withdrawal from Avdiivka. So really, you know, some tragic moments in Ukrainian life. But nevertheless, what we can see, we see that basically in February, 89% of Ukrainians believe in victory. 89%, despite all the problems. Ukrainians are becoming more pragmatic, so they understand it will not happen tomorrow. It may take several years, but nevertheless, they believe in victory. What do they understand by victory? This is another question. 53% are saying that this is the territorial integrity of Ukraine, so the borders of 1991. And additional 14%, they are saying that actually we will need to even push the war on the territory of Russia. So I would say definitely it's not the official line of the Ukrainian government, the official line is to liberate the territories, but you may see from these figures, 53 plus 14%, that Ukrainians are not going, to make peace at the expense of Ukrainian territory. The trust to institutions in Ukraine remain high. The highest trust is to military, to the army. But if we're talking about the trust to president, it's declined for a while, and we understand why. Because 2 years in the war, that's not easy, and there would be some criticism towards government. And Ukraine remains democracy even under martial law. So you may watch the television, you may read the internews sources. There is a lot of discussion about what government is doing bad, what government is doing good. So there is continuing, continuing debate. But nevertheless, the trust to president was, I believe it's January figures, about 68%, the people who are trusting to president of Ukraine. And I remember that in Davos, Switzerland, some foreign prime ministers and ministers of foreign affairs, they said that if they had such a level of trust, they would be very, very happy. So again, there is a certain decline in trust to president, but nevertheless, people accept the fact that there would be no elections under martial law during the war, and 69% of Ukrainians are against any elections, because it's not realistic to conduct democratic elections in the present day situation. It would play only into the hands of Russia, because we do not want just to tick the box. We need to have real competitive elections, and real competitive elections will involve, debate, open fight between the government and opposition. And there is a general agreement also between political forces in Ukraine that we should avoid this electoral fight during the war with Russia. Now, my final point is about the future of negotiations. Can we have negotiations with Russia? Unfortunately, actually, recent statements from Putin and Medvedev, they show that they don't want negotiations. They would like to exterminate Ukraine as a country and to seize Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkov, and other important cities of Ukraine. It's not about Donbass and Russian-backed separatists, so-called Russian-backed separatists. It's about the very existence of Ukraine. So even if we imagine, so now I believe there's no background for real negotiations. Negotiations can be about withdrawal of Russian troops, but Russia doesn't want to discuss it. They understand only the language of force, like it happened with their defeats on the Black Sea and restoration of Ukrainian export on the Black Sea. If we agree, rational point, this is a rational point, for if we have a conflict, we need to have some kind of compromise, and we hear from the West that maybe Ukraine should agree with the loss of Crimea, part of Donbass, and something like that, and part of other occupied Russian territories. So 2 points against this position. First of all, what Russia is doing on the occupied territories. This is an official term. De-Ukrainianize Ukraine. De-Ukrainianize Ukraine. So constant repression of everything Ukrainian, deportation of Ukrainians and Ukrainian children, terror against Ukrainians, and they would like to change also the demographic situation. So they are bringing people from Russia to the occupied territories in order to change the demographic balance. This is the first reason why we shouldn't stick to the point that Russia may keep these territories for some time. The second point is the whole history of relations with Russia shows that Russia would not stop. Putin would not stop. So that's why, unfortunately, we need to solve this situation, and to solve this situation on the battleground. This is the reality, harsh reality for us, for Ukrainians, because we are paying by our lives. In this situation, we appreciate definitely international support in any field, and we appreciate Argentinian support during the voting in the UN on territorial integrity of Ukraine, the support of Ukraine in voting for suspension of Russia from UN Human Rights Council, and this was done under previous government, and we know the position of the new government, so we hope for the continuation of Argentinian support. And again, we need to, while talking about, general resistance to Putin, that we cannot agree with the occupation of Ukrainian land, still we can discuss some, more narrow issues, but very, very important for the whole world, like food security, nuclear security. Let's remind you that never ever in history foreign military occupied the nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe. This is a direct blackmail from Russia. Ecological security, deportations of children, and so on and so forth. So, and I believe that, again, the countries should put pressure on Russia. It could be in different forms. It could be within Ukrainian formula of peace. It could be on different forums. But let's be honest, Putin understands only the language of force. So if we stand together, together we stand. Divided we fall, not only Ukraine. I believe that together we stand in the same way as 89% of Ukrainians believe in victory. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Haran, for your presentation and for sharing your thoughts with us. Let's now move on to our next distinguished speaker. She is Tatiana Kastueva-Shian. She is a research fellow and director of the Russia NIS Center at the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. Before joining the institute, she taught international relations for the French-Russian master at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, also known as MGIMO. Tatiana has authored books and currently heads the trilingual electronic collection Rusi Nations. She holds degrees from the State University of Ekaterinburg and a Franco-Russian Master in International Relations from the University of Sciences Po and MGIMO University, as well as the University of Marne-la-Vallée in France. Tatiana, the floor is open.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Good morning. I hope you can see me and hear me well. I had to connect with my mobile phone. I don't know why, but the video on computer doesn't work. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for your kind invitation. It's a honor, it's a pleasure to see the familiar faces of colleagues like Professor Haran and Professor Iskandarian. And I'm going to apologize immediately. I won't be able to stay until the end of the event. I have another engagement in 2 hours that had been planned for a long time, and I did warn the organizers. So 2 years after the war, the evidence is that the prospects for ending the war remain very uncertain. What is interesting to note is that to understand how this war might end, we need to follow both the front line and the domestic developments of the Russian aggressor and of the victim, Ukraine, but also in the Western countries, in European countries, in these especially decisive years, when there are parliamentary elections in the European Union that are likely to bring a lot of populists into parliament, and the presidential elections in the United States, where Trump, who has declared his hostility to aid for Ukraine, is likely to win. A dream scenario for Vladimir Putin is the collapse of aid to Ukraine, which without outside help will not be able to defend itself militarily and to be sustainable financially. He's seeking to contribute to this by supporting pro-Russian forces in Europe, whose spectrum is broad within many countries. I'm a Russian specialist, but I have been asked today to present Europe's vision and perception of the conflict. I will make 3 points. The first one about the surprise of war and Europe's lack of preparation. The second one about the very rapid and even unexpectedly changes, adaptation and solutions. And the last one about risks and the challenges after 2 years of war. The first one about the surprise of war and Europe's unpreparedness. Clearly, Europe didn't see the large-scale war coming and was unprepared, except for United States and the United Kingdom, who started arming Ukraine and training its soldiers after 2014, while Berlin in Paris made the Minsk Agreement a kind of sacred cow. Even when the Americans said before the war that the attack was imminent, the Europeans didn't believe it. They had the same satellite images, the Americans shared the intelligence in their possession, but Europeans didn't believe it. I think it goes much more deeper than just mistrust of the American who lied about the weapon of mass destruction in Iraq. The real issue is that Russia and Europe had very different perceptions of how the world would evolve after the Cold War. Despite of perception of the fall of the Soviet Union as a peaceful process, war was accompanied all Russia's evolution since the fall of Soviet Union. On its own soil, I think about the 2 Chechen wars, or on its periphery, Transnistria, Tajikistan, Nagorno-Karabakh. Interestingly, a sense of direct military threat has never left Russians. Since the early 2000s, according to Levada Center polls, between 37 and 88 of Russians believe that there is a direct military threat to Russia from other countries. So the need for investment in the army was widely endorsed by the population, who have growing confidence in army. Each war, Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, Ukraine, corresponds to a spike in the popularity curve of Vladimir Putin, who, and it should be remembered, was elected against the backdrop of the war in Chechnya. The discourse of Russia's hostile environment on destabilizing Western action, both within Russia since 2011 protests and on its periphery with the color revolutions, and on the use of force as the best means of retaliation gradually took hold under Vladimir Putin. And the victory in the Great Patriotic War has been placed at the heart of the national narrative, with the formula we can repeat it rather than never again. So the war in Ukraine, I think, has long since matured in people's mind. All the milestones set since Putin came into power suddenly make sense for Russians in February 2022 to justify the war. This development represents a big difference from Europe, which enjoyed the dividends of peace, reduced funding of war industries, and the presence of American troops were reducing in Europe before the war. Even after Crimea, President Macron organized a meeting with Putin in Bregenton, and the Germans launched the construction of Nord Stream 2 in the belief that mutual interdependence and trade can prevent war and contribute to the normalization of Russia. Europe saw the war in Georgia, for example, as the remnants of the old world rather than the beginnings of the world to come. Post-Cold War Europe no longer believed in a new possibility of large-scale war. It was disarming, with only 2 of the European countries, NATO members, that were meeting 2% military spending targets before 2014, United Kingdom and France. European defense industries focused on high-performance, high-tech weapons, but in small quantities. The reason that I describe it in detail is to explain just how shocking February 24 was for Europe. It was a rude awakening, but we must recognize the reaction was much faster, stronger, and more unanimous than we could have expected. A kind of mental revolution for the European Union. My second point is about these reactions, quick adaptation, and unexpected solutions. The first one is about sanctions. Europe was quick to adopt sanctions. Today, Russia is the most sanctioned economy in the world. It would have been naive to hope that sanctions would change Putin's macabre political will or cause the collapse of the Russian economy, which is highly integrated into the global economy and whose raw materials are important for many countries. Sanctions are the solution, a kind of intermediate solution by default between waging war on Russia and limiting ourselves to political declarations and condemnation in the United Nations. Today, the realistic aims of sanctions is to reduce Russia's ability to finance the war effort, to limit the access of different components for armaments. The Russian model is based on energy revenues, which are the main sources of income for the Russian state. Despite its dependence on Russian materials, the European Union has adopted unprecedented energy sanctions, and all 27 member countries, including Hungary, unanimously renew them every 6 months. This is unprecedented. One innovative sanction is the cap price, which sets a ceiling on the price at which Russian oil can be purchased. But Russia manages to circumvent many of its sanctions. Its trade with Turkey, with Kazakhstan, with Armenia has soared over the past 2 years. It has bought frigates to create a phantom fleet. That's why the main goal of the latest sanctions package is to put secondary sanctions on companies and countries that don't respect Western sanctions, forcing them to stop doing business with Russians. And it's working. Some Chinese and Emirati banks and companies are beginning to be sanctioned on the American market. It's a very new trend. Europe's gas strategy is the right one. Looks for gas elsewhere, even in Australia, United States, Norway, Africa, Qatar, Canada. Lower European consumption, increasing gas stocks before winter, strengthening intra-European gas solidarity, limiting the impact on the population and business. Russia's gas delivery to Europe have fallen by almost 50%. The Russian sales to China and India, of course, but these buyers now have the power to negotiate hard. Russia sold to China for 15 billion cubic meters, whereas it sold to the European Union for 190 BCM, which is not exactly the same volume. Another solution was the aid to Ukraine, and Professor Garan told about it, both civilian and military. The European Union has granted 50 billion euro in assistance for Ukraine. There is a mechanism created in 2021, the European Peace Facility. This is an extra budgetary fund used for equipment and non-lethal weapons, such as personal protective equipment, first aid kits and fuel, as well as lethal weapons, ammunition and missiles. Between 2022 and 2023, the European Union has mobilized almost 6 billion euro under the European Peace Facility to support the Ukrainian armed forces. Another solution, on a different kind of solution, is the creation of European political community as an informal forum for intergovernmental cooperation, launched at the initiative of French President Emmanuel Macron during the French presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2022, against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The first summit took place in Prague, the second in Chisinau in Moldova. 44 states participated. The added value of this platform for dialogue is the major geopolitical issues can be discussed on an equal footing. But I understand that questions remain among many countries how the European political community is articulated with European Union membership. That doesn't replace, but create a community of shared values. And of course, another great solution was the granting of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as candidate country status. It's a remarkable achievement. Despite the objections of certain countries, such as Hungary, the joint decision was taken. Nobody said that it will be easier. Ukraine has many reforms to carry out, including the quality of governance and the fight against corruption. There is an adjustment and adaptation cost for the European Union too. We have to recognize that, in particular for the common agricultural policy. We can see the brutality with which Polish farmers are reacting, and wagons of Ukrainian corn have been overturned recently at the border. Generally speaking, European Union enlargement must be accompanied by reform to deeper integration. That is a real challenge for the European Union to combine the both ways. And my last point for the second part is about France, because it's a very interesting case to study. France has come a long way. Today, France is the forefront of aid to Ukraine, even more than Germany, not in financial terms, but in political ones. It was the trigger for the supply of tanks. It is at the head of an artillery coalition, and recently President Macron caused an uproar by mentioning the possibility of sending ground troops, which triggered a wave of denials from other European countries. As you can see, the workings of the 27th national European Union are not exactly smooth and linear. That's why I say it's sometimes a miracle to manage to hold the same line toward Russia. If we do, it's because Russia is perceived as a real threat to our own security, but also to our internal stability. And let me move to my third point about risks and challenges after 2 years of war. The first one, of course, is the risk of war of attrition. There is no way out of the conflict that we can see now, no prospect of negotiation. China is turning Kyiv and Moscow just now to resume its role as mediator. In reality, after 2 years of war, China is not perceived as a mediator by the West, but as Russia's partner. Any scenario remains possible, including a horizontal or vertical extension of the conflict. Within the state, there are forces advocating negotiation and the concession of territories by Ukraine, but not at the governmental level, which considers that it's up to Ukraine to decide when to accept negotiation. Ukrainian considers that there is no alternative. The choice for Ukrainian is not between war and peace. As Estonian President Kaja Kallas said recently on French television, there is peace and peace. For Western Europe, since the Second World War, it was freedom and prosperity. And for us, it was occupation and deportation. That was exactly the Professor Garan described. In a war of attrition, Russia is organizing itself to hold out and believes that time is on its side, that Ukraine will burn out and then Western unity will crumble. This is why President Macron has repeatedly said that the main challenge is to help Ukraine hold out over the long term. The second risk, of course, is the risk of division. Russia is seen as a threat to regional security, certainly, but there are risks on other fronts too. Russia is working to exacerbate the divisions within each European society, between European states by focusing on Hungary and Austria, but also transatlantic solidarity between the United States and Europeans. This hybrid war risks reinforcing divisions, making society dysfunctional and paralyzing governments. Hence, policies such as the banning of Russian media outlets like Russia Today and Sputnik, or a more muscular response to attempts at interference in European and domestic affairs. This year, there will be several moments of vulnerability and opportunity for Russia to influence. The European parliamentary election in June, I said, the Olympic Games in France, and the American elections in the United States. Vigilance is called for. And the last point, the last risk is about the possible war spreading, including to other Eurasian countries. French Minister of the Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, cited two upcoming hotbeds of tension, Armenia and Moldova. The European Union needs to rethink its Eastern neighborhood policy, the South Caucasus and the Central Asia relationships. There are much more demand for Europe in these countries, as demonstrated by Macron's visit to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan last November. How to respond to their demand without destabilizing and weakening them in the face of Russia is a real dilemma. And I think it will be a good bridge to the next speaker that I think will speak about South Caucasus precisely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tatiana, for sharing your input with us. Unfortunately, Alexei and Tatiana have to leave earlier today. So if any of you have one or two short questions for them, yes, please.
I'm actually having more like comments than a question. Thank you, Tatiana. I cannot see you. I hope you are there. I have a comment to see you. In your interesting talk, you mentioned at the beginning that Europe didn't expect the war. Only US.
Excuse me, could you please speak a little higher?
Okay.
It's not possible to hear for me. I don't know for Professor Garany.
I saw Tatiana is not listening. Yeah.
Okay, so again, I'm from the Polish embassy here in Buenos Aires. And now can you hear me now? Or not? Okay.
Please come here.
There is a kind of echo for me. I don't know if one of person on the tribune can repeat eventually the question. It was not possible to hear.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
What about now? Is it okay now?
Yes.
Can you now? Okay. So for the third time, I'm from the Polish embassy in Buenos Aires. And I just wanted to make a comment. Thank you for interesting talk. I just wanted to refer to what you said that Europe wasn't prepared or didn't expect the war in Ukraine, that only like US and United Kingdom were prepared and were expected it. I just wanted to mention that in 2008, so quite a while ago, over 15 years ago, our president, Lech Kaczyński, was in Georgia, and this is when he actually said that if we don't stop Russia now in Georgia, then after Georgia will be Ukraine, then other Baltic countries, and then maybe Poland. So actually, he kind of predicted the war. It's now we interpret it like as a prophecy that if we actually, he was very much against like cooperation of European cooperation with Russia, because this is basically, he was saying that if we keep like doing business with Russia, they will accumulate money and then they will start the war. So I just wanted to put this attention to this fact. Thank you.
Yeah, I take your point. I could have said except Poland and the Baltic states. But what I saw in Germany and in France it was a real kind of denial of the possibility of a large scale war. So my point was much more about countries like France, where I live, about Germany, about Italy. And of course, these countries have a right in European Commission. So at the level of Brussels and European Commission, it was not the possible perspective before the war either. There was a kind of lines of division between the east of the Europe and the west before the war. And I think now precisely the good point of the war is a much more united Europe that shared the perception of security, insecurity, and threats toward Russia. I'm not saying that all problems are solved and that Europe is completely united now, but less divided, I have to say, than before the war. Because the Western Europe saw that precisely Poland and Baltic states were right about the analysis of Russia.
Thank you. Do we have one more question? Any questions?
Online,
I don't know if there.
are there any questions? No? Okay,
All right.
so we can go on with the speaker.
Okay. Well,
Before. So, Alexei, Tatiana, thank you very much, because now we're going on with Alexander and the other speakers. I'm really grateful for your interventions and your time, which I know is very, very valuable. So thank you very much. See you. Merci, Tatiana.
Excuse me, actually, I wanted to because there were no questions, but I have two comments, and I think it's important.
Please go ahead, Alexei, please.
And I will stay for an hour and a half here. I will continue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, regarding elections in the European Parliament, I think, well, I'm an old guy, so I remember from the times of the Soviet Union when I was a student in the 70s that NATO is collapsing, EU is collapsing, which didn't happen. Definitely, we have now new trends, but new risks. But at the same time, if we are talking about European Parliament, look, what we will have in these elections. In every country, there is its own how to say it, own path and different jumps of the support to left or right populist. However, so this is important, the situation in every country. This is about elections to the European Parliament. And if you look at the composition of European Parliament, previously two factions always had majority: Social Democratic and EPP, European People's Party, Christian Democrats. Two had majority. Then, with Macron and increase of the influence of liberals, there are three factions in the European Parliament which have majority. So, frankly speaking, maybe I am too optimistic because I call myself survivor of 3 revolutions in Ukraine. But I don't think that left or far right populist will have a dominance in European Parliament. That's my prediction. So let's see what will happen. But I don't think they may increase their representation, but I don't think they will have any kind of majority. And the second point I would like to bring in is about relations between Ukrainians and Russians. Well, my relations with Tanya are incredibly good. So if sometimes there is discussion about good Russians, Tanya is an example of good Russian. However, yes, we consider that Russian society is ill. That's right. That's right. That's the problem. And many people believe in this Putin's myth about Ukraine and NATO and proxy war and so on and so forth. But if we are talking about Russians who are living in Ukraine, ethnic Russians who are living in Ukraine, look, we don't have contradictions with them. Okay? So they're a legitimate part of Ukrainian political nation. We continue, now we have a decolonization process from below, which means that people would like to distance themselves from Russia. They would like to switch to Ukrainian language. This is a trend from below as a result of this full-scale invasion. But still, there are Russian speakers, and they will exist in Ukrainian society, and there are ethnic Russians who are living in Ukrainian society. Again, they are a legitimate part of Ukrainian political nation. Actually, I would like to tell you a secret that when we are talking to each other, we don't know whom we are talking to. To Russian, ethnic Russian, to ethnic Ukrainian, we use both languages and we do not care about it. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. And actually, many Ukrainian soldiers at the front lines, they continue to speak Russian language. and they are saying in Russian language, we are fighting against Putin for Ukrainian Donbass. So that's my point. So yes, now we have this trend towards more Ukrainization, but this is kind of decolonization trend. But again, ethnic Russians, ethnic representatives of other minorities are legitimate part of Ukrainian political nation. And I think our president, who you know was a Russified Jew, and our Minister of Defense, who is Muslim Crimean Tatar, this is a very good example of Ukrainian political nation. Thank you.
Sorry, if I may just answer to on 2 points. I would like to share the optimism about European parliamentary election. What I see in France, that Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen, Jordan Bardella have the first place in polls today. So it's, I think, a very worrying trend. And about your second point, thank you so much to speak about Russians that don't share the goals of these wars and don't accept President Putin's awful policy. And we saw the last weekend during the burial of Alexei Navalny that people that were running on the cemetery were scanding that they were against the war. And Ukrainians are good people. I don't know if you hear that, but there was this kind of slogans on the cemetery.
Yes, so we really appreciated this support, you know, from brave Russians. But unfortunately, I think Tanya would agree to that. The majority of Russian society, they prefer the situation or we support the war or we do not care. We are staying aside. We do not want to.
Exactly. Unfortunately, it's a topic for another conference for 2 hours. I'm ready if you want one day to do this.
Tanya, we are ready to come to Buenos Aires for that, right? It's a wonderful place.
I engage you both for the next one on this matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexei and Tatiana, for your time. Our next presenter is Alexander Iskandarian. Alexander is a political scientist and director of the Caucasus Institute based in Yerevan. He extensively studies political conflicts, post-communist transformations, and nation building in the former USSR, including the South and Northern Caucasus and Central Asia. Iskandarian also engages in research, advocacy, and scholarly events through the Caucasus Institute. Mr. Iskandarian, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see all my old good friends here. I would try to look at the problem, I mean the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the second anniversary of which we're marking these days, from post-Soviet space. This invasion dramatically changed, I would say, post-Soviet space, and we can argue that this war has become a kind of milestone of the history of this space, which perhaps should no longer be called post-Soviet space, but something like post-Soviet. The countries of this space are exposed to direct and indirect consequences of this Russian move, and almost everything that happens here can only be discussed in the context of Russian-Ukrainian war. Arguably, the invasion of Ukraine did not happen out of the blue. It had its precursors. The first precursor was, I think, in 2008, Russian-Georgian war, or maybe not even the war per se, or not so much the war. Wars were fought between post-Soviet states before 2008 as well. What was special was Russia's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. By recognizing these two de facto states, Russia made it clear that it was ready to revise the post-Soviet borders that had until that point at least formally been practically sacred to Russia. Even while it did support in various ways the various secessionist movements in former Soviet republics, Russia recognized the territorial integrity of its neighboring countries and swore by post-Soviet borders. In 2008, this was no longer the case. The other precursor was Russia's annexation of the Republic of Crimea in 2014. This was,
Разрешается целоваться.
sorry,
Поцелуйчики разрешаются.
sorry, I listened something.
Please do not forget to turn your microphones off. Thank you.
Okay, Crimea in 2014, not just recognizing the independence of a territory forming part of sovereign state, but annexing it. Finally, this trend escalated in the Russians' invasion of Ukraine and annexation of what they call Donbas or Donetsk and Luhansk republics, etc., etc. So I mean that it was annexation of vaguely defined Ukrainian territories. We have thus seen the transformation of Russia from a traditionalist country in terms of borders into a revisionist one. One of the consequences of this transformation has been that Russia's neighbors now feel that their territorial integrity is threatened by its mere proximity and which to somehow protect themselves from any new post-imperialist escapades by Russian Federation. Of course, the threat is felt first and foremost by countries directly bordering Russia. Their fears have manifested itself in various ways, ranging from extreme caution in relations with Russia to the search for allies and guarantors outside its territory, territory of former USSR. And with the outbreak of the large-scale aggression against Ukraine, other effects of this alienation began to appear. First of all, policies vary depending on the geographical location of the countries. For the states of the western part of former USSR, the Ukrainian war has become almost the nucleus of their foreign policy. The threats perceived by countries geographically close to the war region led to the fact that most countries on the eastern periphery of Europe, completely and unique, locally aligned with Ukraine, and just as completely and unequivocally supported the West in its efforts to help Ukraine fight against Russia's invasion. This is, of course, true for Baltic states, which are NATO members, but also for Moldova, a country that, especially at the first stage of the war, strongly feared for its own territory. Moldova's choice of sides in the Russian-Ukraine war was by now manifested itself institutionally when Moldova, alongside Ukraine, began negotiations with the EU, applied for membership, and was granted candidate status. Belarus is displaying the opposite type of behavior, lacking options to align itself with the West or Ukraine. It had no choice but to unequivocally side with Russia, despite the fact that before the war, Belarus tried to play an entirely different role in that tried to serve as Russia connection with the West, acting a neutral platform, neutral platforms for various formats of interaction between the West and Russians. Now, this has become completely impossible. At most, Lukashenko can avoid direct participation in the war. It is the best Belarus can do at the moment. Just as which the Baltic states and Moldova, the position of Belarus is unambitious. Belarus cannot refuse to align itself with Russia, and Russia cannot refuse to support the regime in Belarus already. The situation is completely different in South Caucasus region, which I live and spoke from. Arguably, the reason for the geographical, unlike the west of the former USSR, which borders Russia on one side and Europe on the other, South Caucasus has Iran and Turkey as its other neighbors, not Europe. According to the policy of the countries on the South Caucasus is much more ambivalent. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan fear Russia and do not entertain any hopes of receiving direct help from European countries in the event that their territory is attacked. Of course, Turkey, a NATO member, borders on all three countries of the South Caucasus. However, Turkey is very special NATO member, both in terms of the extent of its interaction with Russia, and in the degree to which it policies in the South Caucasus and some other regions are independent from the NATO. Georgia is trying to achieve some sort of equilibrium between support for Ukraine and effort to avoid infiltration in Russia. Azerbaijan look full advantage of Russia's concentration on the Ukrainian direction. It has resolved the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh by means of total ethnic cleansing of the Armenian population of the unrecognized republic. It did so without any regard for the presence of Russian so-called peacekeepers in the contested region, rightly believing that Russia was not going to open a second front in the south, as such an important stage of a war that is considered existential, because for Russia this isn't just a conflict with Ukraine, but with the entire West, collective West, that they call it. Arguably, if it had not been for the Ukrainian war, such a brutal operation of Azerbaijan would have been simply impossible. As a result, Armenia is gradually leaving Russia's orbit. Russia has proved completely useless in the very function that was almost importance for Armenia, and had been Armenia's reason for joining the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO. That function had been to ensure the security of Armenia and the survival of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia did neither. As a result, Russia had lost its status as the sole guarantor of security in the South Caucasus, which will inevitably lead and is already leading to Russia's withdrawal from the region of a geopolitical sense. This, of course, is not something that happens overnight. This process will, in all probability, or rather extended. As Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan applied put it, it's not Armenia leaving the CSTO, it's the CSTO leaving Armenia. Of course, trade, economic, and other ties will probably survive this divorce because the region simply cannot exist without them, but just geographically. But what used to be foundation of Russian influence in the region is gradually becoming extinct. In 2021, Armenia bought 96% of its weapon from Russia. This year, it bought about 10%. 10. Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan at the Russian military base in Armenia are becoming non-functional and atavistic. Even if they remain in the region, they no longer serve any purpose. Russia no longer has anything to offer to the field of security to either Azerbaijan, which has already succeeded in taking over Nagorno-Karabakh, or my country, Armenia, which has already lost Nagorno-Karabakh with people from there, with exodus of them. In the case of Georgia, which has a Black Sea coast, terribly bordering on NATO and EU countries, Romania and Bulgaria, through the sea. On the other side of the sea, you have NATO and you have EU. Institutional changes are already taking place, like Moldova. Georgia has become a candidate for EU membership. For Azerbaijan, it gradually evolves into a classic petrostate of the Middle Eastern type. Proximity to Turkey is becoming a state-building factor. Therefore, the least Russia has to do is to take this into account. Armenia is looking for security formats outside the post-Soviet space. This shift are not as rapid as the ones happening in the western flank of Russia, but they lead to this some direction to diversification of influence. The natural process that has been going on since the beginning of the collapse of the USSR has accelerated sharply. I'm not an expert on Central Asian region. One thing that is clear is that the region, there is a wide range of completely different actors, such as China or Taliban Afghanistan. Besides, Islamic radicalism is present in Central Asian countries, inside these countries. All this makes what is now happening in Ukraine less relevant for these countries. But nevertheless, even in Central Asia, the instruments of Russian influence, for example, CSTO, are becoming more and more decorative and less functional. Serious fears of the monopoly influence of China, a huge neighbor in every sense, lead to the idea of the need to avoid radical steps and refrain from alienating Russia. In the final analysis, Central Asian countries have no European prospects, and the region is very fragile. That means that disrupting the balance could have drastic consequences. However, there are an obvious desire to attract as many outside actors into a region as possible, from South Korea to US and European states. Of course, all these trends are far from final. We live inside the unfinished process. Making predictions is a thankless task. A lot depends on how long the war lasts and how it ends. However, even regardless of the military outcome, the political results of the war are already clear. Russia has suffered political defeat. It is cut off from the West, subject to isolation and sanctions. Its image is severely damaged, and there is no way to can be mended. This was already happened, and it's already affected Russia's options in its immediate environment. It also makes the process of disintegration of the former post-Soviet community more and more irreversible. We cannot say that the aggression against Ukraine set the process in motion, but it did accelerate it quite a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skandarian, for such a comprehensive geopolitical analysis on Russia's neighbors. Now let me introduce our next speaker. His name is Alim Aliev, and he serves as the Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute. He is a human rights defender, curator of educational and cultural projects, researcher, and journalist. He is also a board member of PEN Ukraine and co-founder of Crimea SOS NGO. He is also co-author of the book Mustafa Dzhemilev, Unbreakable, about the Crimean Tatars leader, and he is a member of the supervisory boards of several Ukrainian NGOs and a participant and speaker of Crimean advocacy missions in the Council of Europe, European Parliament, OSCE, the United Nations Security Council, among other political institutions. Alim, you have the floor.
Buenos dias. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be with you and to speak to you about Crimea issues and about the situation in Crimea. First of all, I want to start about the today's case. Today at 4 a.m. in Russian-occupied Crimea, FSB officials searched the houses of Crimean Tatars. It were 10 houses. In Bakhchisarai region, it was the activists of Crimean Tatar movement were searched, and religious figures were searched in Jankoy region in Crimean Peninsula. All detained Crimean Tatars, activists and religious figures were sent to the FSB directorate in Simferopol, and the capital of Crimea. They are currently being investigated. And according to preliminary information from lawyers, all Crimean Tatars are charged with terrorism. Unfortunately, it's a usual situation in Crimea during the last 10 years. Now today, Ukraine is going through two opposite processes at the same time. Part of our country is decolonizing, and part of this process is decommunization. For example, we are getting rid of the totalitarian Soviet legacy, renaming cities and streets named after our executioners. We are developing our modern culture and switching to the Ukrainian language. I call it reclaiming our names. But in the occupied territories of Ukraine, the opposite process is taking place, the process of recolonization. I want to briefly talk about this using the example of Crimea. It's my native land. I am originally from Crimea. I'm Crimean Tatar, and Crimean Tatars are indigenous people of Ukraine. In general, human rights defenders documented more than 5,000 cases of human rights violations on the peninsula during these 10 years, from the violations of religious and ethnicity ground to violations against freedom of speech. And today, when we talk about political prisoners, more than 80% of Crimean political prisoners are Crimean Tatars. But it's only the tip of iceberg. With the beginning of the full-scale invasion, repressions on the peninsula intensified significantly. Crimea, after 2014, has become a role model for the occupation of new territories in 2022. From the creation of places of torture in basements, kidnappings of journalists and activists, to attempts to hold so-called referendums. Russia wants not only to conquer Ukrainian lands, but first of all to destroy Ukrainian identity, our statehood, and our right to the future. If we talk about how now we have this situation in Crimea, I want to start about identity. Violation of the right of self-determination of Crimean, indigenous Crimean Tatar people who see themselves as an integral part of Ukraine. In April 2016, Russian authorities banned the representative body of Crimean Tatars, Medjlis, calling it an extremist organization. I will give the broader context about Medjlis. During all of the period of independence of Ukraine, Medjlis was the main political and social institution that gathered all of Crimean Tatars in Crimea, in different corners of Crimea. And according to this, I want to tell the story of my friend, Nariman Jalal. Nariman is a journalist, first deputy head of the Medjlis, and he, during all of these years, is the largest voice of all of free inhabitants of Crimea. But on September 2021, Russian security officials detained Nariman and two Akhtemov cousins hour and so-called explosion in a gas pipeline. Since his detention, Nariman was handcuffed and had a bag over his head for almost 24 hours. Akhtemov cousin confessed under torture also. And we consider arrest of Nariman Jalal and Akhtemov's cousins as a revenge for the Crimea platform. Nariman was a speaker of this summit. And Crimean, as you know, Crimean Platform Summit that launched in 2021 is an international mechanism of the occupation of Crimea that launched by the President Zelensky. And today, these days, Russia arrested Nariman and sentenced him to 17 years in prison. Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians with a clear national identities has been viewed as a threat to Russia's security in Crimea by the peninsula's occupying authorities since 2014. That's why Russia tries to destroy tangible and intangible cultural heritage that doesn't fit into the Kremlin's modern ideology. One good example is the fate of the famous 16th century Grand Palace, a significant emblem of Crimean Tatar culture. This crucial object of the tangible heritage is being distorted under the guise of restoration. What Russian officials claim is restoration work to preserve the palace instead has involved the removal of original oak ceiling beams and handmade roofing ties and damage to walls frescoes. And also we should talk about Crimean Tatar language. Our language is listed as one of the disappearing languages by UNESCO. That's why Crimean Tatars see its preservation as one of our key tasks these days. Only 3% of pupils in Crimea, students in Crimea, are studying in Crimean Tatar. To stop the language from disappearing, parents create private initiatives, private schools to learn the language, as well as speak it at home with their children. And if we talk about Ukrainian language in the Crimea, today we haven't any Ukrainian teaching schools in Crimea. But of course, before the temporary occupation, such schools we had. And another topic is militarization. Crimea has turned from the touristic corner, the beautiful landscapes, into a military zone where fear and mistrust reigns. The military equipment, regular army, and security services are transferred from Russia to Crimea. This led to the fact that the peninsula became one of the main military bases for Russia to carry out aggression against Ukraine and launching the missiles, for example, launching the missiles from Ukraine to from Crimea to another territories of Ukraine. But I want to stress on the militarization of consciousness of the inhabitants of peninsula, which begins from the childhood. In kindergartners, on so-called memorial days, they're forced to wear St. George ribbons and the stylized uniform of Soviet army. In schools, there are paramilitary organizations such as UnArmia that promotes the cult of Russian army and cult of war, as well as form the image of the enemy from Ukraine and glorify the occupation of the peninsula by Russia. And in this context, the occupation system humiliates and discriminates against Crimean Tatar children. And that's why, since the beginning of the full-scale war, Russia has been trying to forcibly mobilize people into its army in the occupied territories in Crimea. And first of all, they began to do it with Crimean Tatars. And for us, it's in 2022 was a new wave of repressions, which is considering as a war crime according to the international law, because provisions of the Geneva Convention prohibit the occupying power from forcing people who are under protection to serve in its army. And this situation led that the thousands of Crimean Tatar were forced to leave the peninsula only in September 2022. And as I understand in my expert view, the same situation could be in the nearest future. But I also want to note the growing resistance of the inhabitants of Crimea and the Russian occupation, which has taken place on the peninsula for all of this 10 years. Only this last 2 years, the occupation courts of Crimea opened more than 500 proceedings regarding bringing Crimea residents to administrative and criminal liability for so-called discrediting of Russian armed force. This is about anti-war slogans and actions, public statements, stop the war, and condemnation of Russian aggression and war crimes. The performance of even the performance of Ukraine songs. An illustrative case for me is the case of Crimean artist Bogdan Ziza, who in May 2022, in a protest against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, doused the building of the occupation administration in the city of Eupatoria with yellow and blue paint. And Bogdan was first kidnapped by Russian security forces, and he was tortured, and today he's assumed of terrorism also. Last but not least, it's about population replacement. Since the beginning of the occupation, near 70,000 of the inhabitants left Crimea. It was a brain drain. There are social active persons disloyal to the Russian authorities, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, it's young professionals, students, business persons, public leaders, journalists, artists, etc., etc., etc. But there is a reserve trend. The peninsula is colonized from the Russian state officials, security officers, security services, even pensioners and business persons. According to the Ukraine's NGO and state officials, the number of people who arrived to Crimea reached 800,000 people. It's near 1/3 of all of population of Crimea. And if we compare the situation in Crimea before and now, what's important, thousands and thousands of people in Crimea really want that Ukraine bring Crimean Tatar and Ukraine flags to the peninsula. And I said that this war started from Crimea. And this war also will end with the liberation of Crimea. And for Crimean Tatars as indigenous people, it's also our war, but it's not the war only about land. Yeah, it's this war for us. It's the war of for our values and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam, for sharing your deep understanding on the situation of Crimean Tatars. It was a very interesting presentation. Let's go now to our last speaker before the break, who will be joining us through a video presentation. Her name is Alexandra Matvichuk. She's a Ukrainian human rights lawyer and civil society leader based in Kyiv. She heads the nonprofit organization Center for Civil Liberties, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, and is a campaigner for democratic reforms in her country and the OSCE region. Alexandra has also served as vice president of International Federation for Human Rights since October 2022. So let's listen to her presentation.
My name is Alexandra Matvichuk. I'm a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, and I have been documenting war crimes in this war which Russia had started against Ukraine in 2014. Because this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained the chance for the quick democratic transition. Prior to this, millions of Ukrainians stood up their voice against corrupt authoritarian government who stopped Euro integration process. People peacefully demonstrated on the streets, demanding a chance, just a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And we paid the highest price for this chance. More than hundreds of peaceful protesters were gunned down in the center of Kyiv. But when authoritarian regime collapsed and Ukraine fought this possibility for democratic transition, in order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea, part of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and 2 years ago extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of Britain. And that is why, when we speak about Russia's war against Ukraine, this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Russia not just trying to punish Ukrainian people for our democratic choice, which we made 10 years ago. Russia attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, rule of law, freedom, and human rights are fake values, because they couldn't protect anyone during the war. Russia attempts to convince that state with a powerful military potential and nuclear weapons can break international order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly change internationally recognized borders. And if Russia succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe to do the same. The UN system of peace and security is collapsing before our eyes. And that is why even democratic governments will be forced to invest money not in education, healthcare, business development, culture, not in solving global problems like climate change or social inequality, but in weapons. We'll witness an increasing number of nuclear states and the emergence of new robotic armies and new weapons of mass destruction. If Russia succeeds and this scenario comes true, we'll find ourselves in a world which will be dangerous for everyone, without any exceptions. We have been documenting now in Ukraine how Russian troops deliberately shelling residential buildings, schools, churches, museums, and hospitals, attacking evacuation corridors, torturing people in Federation camps, forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia, how they ban Ukrainian language and culture and destroy Ukrainian cultural heritage, how they robbing, raping, abducting, and killing civilians in occupied territories, and how entire UN system of peace and security can't stop it. And all this hell, which we now face in Ukraine, is a result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committing horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. If we want to stop and prevent wars in the future, we have to punish states and their leaders who start such wars in present. This is a common logic, but in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such a precedent. And that is why we still look into the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals were tried, but only after Nazi regime had collapsed. But we live in a new century. Justice shouldn't be dependent on how and when this war will end. We can't wait. We must establish a special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and top political leadership and high military command of Russian state accountable. We must break the circle of impunity. We must return people their name. And we count on your solidarity, especially because Latin America has a long tradition of investigation and punishment for the severe human rights violation. Because we are dealing with formation of the whole authoritarian bloc. Iran provided Russia with Iranian drones and ballistic rockets. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells. China helped Russia to bypass sanctions and import the Western technologies critical to warfare. Syria voted for Russia in the General Assembly. If authoritarian countries support each other, we democracies have to support each other even more strongly. Because democracies must win wars between authoritarianism and free world. There are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders, like freedom is one of such things, as well as human solidarity. And we need your human solidarity, because only spread of freedom make our world safer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Of course, we send warm greetings from Buenos Aires to you and to the entire Center for Civil Liberties, and congratulations for the job you do on a daily basis. Now, before we continue with the rest of our speakers, we're going to take a short 15-minute break in order to recharge our batteries for the second or last part of the seminar, where we will listen to the rest of our speakers and hold a Q&A session. Thank you very much, and please stick around. Thank you.
Okay.
Se ve, ¿por qué no se ve acá? Perfecto.
Muy bien.
All right, welcome back. Hope you were able to recharge your batteries for the second and last part of the seminar. Let me introduce our next speaker for this second part. Her name is Katerina Rashevska. She is a legal expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights and a PhD fellow at the Institute of International Relations. She is dedicated to protecting the rights of vulnerable victims of international crimes, particularly children. Katerina has represented these interests at prominent international institutions and actively champions the interest of Ukrainian children on international platforms. Katerina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, distinguished audience. It's such a pleasure to participate in this very important event for Ukraine. Contrary to popular perception, Ukrainian children are not collateral damage in this armed conflict. Russia targets them deliberately. The list of international crimes committed against Ukrainian children includes deportations and forcible transfers, unjustifiable delay in repatriation, political indoctrination with characteristics of a crime against humanity, forcible transfer to Russian families, and the eradication of Ukrainian identity, which, if Dolus Specialis is proven, should be qualified as a crime of genocide. We should also not forget the 6 grave violations committed during Russian aggression against Ukrainian children. Today, I would like to tell you a story, because one deportation is always a tragedy, while 19,546 are just statistics. Sashko, a 10-year-old, and 3-year-old Victoria lived with his and her mother in Mariupol. They constantly hid in the basement from shelling. However, their text was so frequent that once, while saving his younger sister, Sashko was injured and lost an eye. Seeking help together with his mother, they were taken to a filtration camp by the Russians, where they were separated. The boy was sent to the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. He was told that his mother had given him up and that he would now be taken to a Russian boarding school. Sashko managed to secretly call his grandmother, who crossed 4 countries to take her grandson to the territory controlled by Ukraine. Now Sashko, with visual impairment because of the Russians, is fighting for his mother. Despite hundreds of letters sent to the authorities of the Russian Federation, the fate of this woman during 2 years remains unknown. Russian agents have taken thousands of children from Ukraine to at least 57 regions of the Russian Federation. From Rostov to Murmansk, Astrakhan, Siberia, Vladivostok, as well as to Belarus and even occupied Georgia, South Ossetia. Among these children, approximately 4,000 are orphans and children deprived of parental care. Russians have displaced entire boarding institutions, claiming that this displacement is an evacuation. However, if Russia acted solely for humanitarian reasons, it would ensure their evacuation in accordance with the Geneva Convention, cooperating with Ukraine and the ICRC. It would provide lists of such children and effectively facilitate their reunification with family members. Instead, Russia deliberately created the conditions for unlawful deportation, publicly intending to keep these children under Russian influence forever. President Putin signed decrees simplifying the imposition of Russian citizenship on Ukrainian children. Again, Russian authorities claim that this is strictly a humanitarian action. However, following a detailed analysis of Russian legislation on citizenship, in our communication, my organization, the Regional Center for Human Rights, demonstrated to the International Criminal Court that if high-ranking officials of the Russian Federation intended to act solely for humanitarian reasons, then they would have pursued legislative changes facilitating access of these children to medical care, educational services, and social benefits, ensuring the right to preserve their Ukrainian identity. Instead, we witnessed Russification, political indoctrination, and militarization of Ukrainian children. In Russian schools, in violation of international law, peace is eradicated from their minds. War is glorified, as well as the desire to die for their new motherland. Ukrainian children are forbidden even to speak Ukrainian, wear and have Ukrainian symbols, and criticize the so-called special military operation. According to Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova, there may be initial resistance, but it eventually transforms into an affection to Russia. Contrary to the rules of international humanitarian law, Ukrainian children are forcibly transferred to the Russian families. We have documented 380 children in families in 24 regions of the Russian Federation. The largest gender age category among them are boys, aged 14 and 17 years old. And among new parents, there are mostly teachers, accomplices of this crime. Almost a year ago, the ICC issued arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. Now they are trying to demonstrate active efforts in returning abducted children, but even according to their own data voiced in the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, only 104 minor Ukrainians were reunited with their families thanks to Russians. This is less than a third part of 388 already returned children. In communications to the International Criminal Court, we have proved that in about 20 mentioned by Russian cases, the Russian Federation only complicated return of our children. In our opinion, such actions have the characteristics of a separate war crime, unjustifiable delay in repatriation. It is unfortunate to state, but over time, the determination to bring the guilty persons to justice for crimes against Ukrainian children is fading. As an example, deported and adopted before the full-scale invasion Crimean orphans are only reflected in the report of the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE. As a result of impunity, now at least 164 Crimean orphans born before the occupation of the peninsula, so Ukrainian children, are offered to the Russians for adoption. What is the international community waiting for? Today, justice for Ukrainian children is not only the accountability for criminals. These are also repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Now, more than even before, we need assistance, particularly from the ICC Trust Fund for Victims, to develop appropriate programs for the Ukrainian children affected by deportation. We also continue to advocate for a more proactive approach on sanctions, confiscation, and repurposing of Russian assets for the needs of our children. We insist that existing mechanisms, especially the Office of the Special Representative for Children at the Armed Conflict Office of Virginia Gamba, should operate properly without making exceptions for individual states. In this context, I want to remind you that despite the inclusion of the Russian armed forces in the so-called list of shame, no action plan has been concluded with the Russian Federation, and unfortunately, crimes committed by Russians are being repeated. We have made our world dangerous for children. That is why today I urge you to be more flexible and creative in applying the existing norms of international conventions, but to be ready to develop new standards and resolutions in order to return Ukrainian children and to prevent the violations of the right of every child, not only Ukrainian, who is currently suffering in armed conflicts. We need to make international justice more friendly, understandable, and open for children. Let me remind us, that the strength of the international community is measured by the well-being of our children. If we don't stand for them today, who will stand for us tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katerina, for your presentation on this highly sensitive topic. I think it's something that we all should follow much closer. Right now, let's move on to our last speaker of this seminar before the Q&A session. She is Domitila Sagramoso. Domitila is a senior lecturer in security and development at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her expertise includes Russian foreign and security policy, violent conflicts, military cooperation, energy trade, commercial relations, and international institutions. She is renowned for her research and significant contributions to academic discourse through publications in STEAM journals. Domitila, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Santiago, and I would like to thank the ambassador very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here and share this panel with you. If I may start, I would like to discuss a bit what the situation is on the ground and how Russia is conducting these operations, and then generally discuss sort of how or to what extent we can envisage some kind of negotiated solution. I don't know if you can hear me properly.
Yes, we can. Perfect.
If I may, I would like to see if I can share one screen, which is a map, which will help me to explain sort of the fronts where we see sort of Russia advancing. As we know, Russia is now sort of a bit taking the initiative, and there are a variety of fronts where they are pushing, and this is primarily, as we know, advancing beyond Avdiivka in the area of Donetsk. There is also pressure around Robotyne in the area of Zaporizhzhia. Of course, there is also pressure here in Kupiansk on the sort of northeastern front line. And also there is quite a lot of sort of pressures in terms of bombardments, as we know, around Kharkiv. And then also here is Kharkiv, and also pressures around Kherson, Odessa, and this whole area of Mykolaiv. So we really see like the entire front line, which is really in a sort of very sensitive moment. And let me just say, a few words about, I don't know how to get away from this, to not share anymore the screen. So let me just say a few words about what is actually how Russia is operating and how it is able to exploit the current sort of opportunities that are there because of Ukraine's vulnerabilities, which were mentioned a bit earlier by other speakers. So Ukrainians, as we know, the Ukrainian units are facing deficits in ammunition and manpower. American assistance is being delayed. It is not clear when the aid package that has been promised of the 61 billion is going to be approved by the US Congress. Western ammunition targets also have not been reached. There's delay in the provision and support of a lot of the Western weaponry, especially from also the European states. And there's also, as we know, ongoing discussions of the kinds of weaponry that Ukraine should receive. And the most relevant discussion now is about the German terrorist missiles, where we know there are big divisions inside Germany within the coalition currently governing Germany, and the Chancellor Scholz very opposed to that. I can explain also why there are challenges around that. So the defensive lines remain quite shaky. It's not clear if Ukrainians have managed to rebuild second lines of defense that can be really strong in terms of preventing further advancement by Russian forces. Russian forces have It has been estimated as sort of 5-to-1 fire advantage. They're regenerating combat units from pipelines in Russia. They're training men in Russia. They're pulling equipment from storage. There is, as we know, great emphasis on military industrial production. Russia is also relying on weaponry that comes and ammunition from North Korea and also Iran, joint production there. And of course, the biggest sort of elephant in the room is, of course, China, an important provider of electronics and elements which are necessary for the production of the more modern kinds of equipment. So Russia is, to a certain extent, in a relative advantageous position now, although, as was mentioned earlier, Ukraine has managed, for example, to neutralize to a certain extent the Black Sea Fleet and open up sort of trading lines on its western coast of the Black Sea, and that has allowed it to continue more effectively with its export activities and gain foreign currency for that. Also, while the United States military support is not at the moment forthcoming, I think European countries are increasingly realizing that the onus is now on them to provide the necessary support. They're trying to wrap up military production. There is a big effort which has been spearheaded by the Czech presidency to acquire weaponry and especially ammunition from even outside the European Union that has been now sort of accepted by European countries. And we are even seeing, as was mentioned, the discussion about potentially sending NATO troops, and that I'm happy also to discuss that point in the Q&A. Also, I think what is important to highlight and is sometimes sort of left aside is the challenges that Russia might face economically. This kind of war economy is not sustainable in the long run. So the question is, how long can Russia afford the war, and what are the domestic political repercussions of the status of war? And I think that the funeral of opposition dissident leader Alexei Navalny showed that there is clearly quite a lot of concern and rejection for the current policy of never-ending war. But I would argue that at the moment, the Russians have, to a certain extent, a sort of a temporary advantage. They have this window of opportunity before potentially Western support, potentially fighter jets, for example, are finally delivered. And so they're trying to really take advantage of this opportunity. So there is also a lot of pressure as a result of that among Western quarters to generate pressure to negotiate. And here the questions that are emerging is whether the sides should engage in negotiations and what kind of compromises could be reached. But before I go into the details of sort of the challenges of negotiations, let me just say a few words about this aspect of the conflict, because there is a tendency to view negotiations and the war as sort of two separate channels. But from the Russian point of view, the information component is as important as what we call the kinetic one. In sort of the analysis or the doctrinal understanding of Russian military warfare, what they call new generation warfare, there is a very important psychological cognitive element or component, which involves not only what sometimes we call cyber warfare or hitting at command, control, and communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, usually known as C4ISR, but also to have a really strong impact on the narrative. And this is what we call sort of this indirect strategy, which is primarily an informational struggle to neutralize the adversary without or with minimal employment of force. So this idea is in a way to influence behavior, to persuade your opponent that in a way there is it doesn't make much sense to fight. So that also includes sort of blurring the lines between war and peace, between the front and the rear. And this is becoming increasingly clear as we see the Russian government carrying out a very effective campaign by co-opting elements of political groups in Western countries, political parties, leaders who are increasingly pushing for negotiations. We see that in Italy, for example, with the Five Star Movement leader coming up very clearly with giving up on providing support to Ukraine. And that is really very important, because we need to understand that that is sort of a broad element of the Russian understanding of warfare, is persuading the enemy into a defeat rather than forcing it into. So it's not only sort of the kinetic attack, but also this element of persuasion by presenting also a false picture of reality, which is very favorable to Russia. The sense that, you know, no matter how much support is provided by the West, Russia will always predominate strongly because it has more resources, more capacity, more manpower. So create this sense of doubt and uncertainty in the opponent and persuade the opponent that it's much better to just give in and that there is no point in resisting. So this sense of attrition over time, of a perpetual war, also with the West, and create a sense of helplessness. And I think this element now is extremely successful in some quarters of the West, not everywhere. But I think globally, this is a very important element. And I really wanted to highlight, because from the Russian perspective, the psychological aspect, which operates at many levels, not just inside Ukraine, as was mentioned by one of the first speakers. There is an operation also inside Ukraine, but it operates more broadly and more globally. And this brings me to the question as to whether one should engage in these kinds of negotiations and what really Russia is trying to achieve in its efforts to convince the West to negotiate. Let me just say a few words about sort of the previous efforts at negotiations and what were the challenges in that respect. And I'm not going to go into the details of the famous Minsk Agreement, which was signed in February 2015 and was brokered by the German and the French governments in Minsk in Belarus. But one of the big questions, which is often not emphasized about this agreement, is that it was a result of negotiations that were carried out under duress. So it wasn't really a sort of a long process of negotiations where both sides felt they were obtaining a sort of a beneficial position. It was really a sort of a challenge for Ukrainians to accept, otherwise they were going to lose additional territory. And this partly explains why there's been very strong opposition among certain quarters inside Ukraine to implement these agreements, and there's never been great consensus. And as the time passed, increasingly there was talk of renegotiating or finding ways around this agreement. And the second point of the Minsk Agreement, if we look at the content, is related to the fact that it had a lot of contradictions. And the most important one was the question around constitutional reform and asking a part of Ukraine to have a special status, which generally one could agree with if you hadn't had sort of Russia as a neighbor trying to utilize these special status regions in the Donbass as instruments to determine Ukraine's foreign and security orientation. So these two elements cannot be seen separately. There's also the question of elections, which had to be held in accordance with the Ukrainian constitution, but at the same time, Ukraine was forced or compelled, according to the Minsk Agreement, to engage in negotiations on the modalities of elections in these separatist regions or special status regions with the representatives. And these were never clearly defined. So There were a lot of issues there that made implementation of this agreement extremely difficult, besides the fact that violence along the front line was never really subdued. But let's move to the second phase of negotiations, which I think were quite relevant and interesting. And that was a period, I would argue, between December 2021 and February 2022, before the outbreak of large-scale war. And here often there is talk, I want to highlight this because there is a perception that Western countries were not ready to negotiate, and that explains or justifies Russia's actions. Now, I don't want to go into the details of whether sort of NATO's posture was the right one or the wrong one. What I just want to highlight is that there were these channels of negotiations which were proposed by the West, and they included a bilateral line with the Americans and the Russians, a multilateral one between NATO and Russia, and also which was going to look at issues around Euro-Atlantic security, and then a more specific one with Russia and the OSCE to resolve the conflict in the Donbass. Interestingly, there was not even discussion on the future of Crimea, so that seemed to be a big concession from the Ukrainian side, although, as we know, at the time, President Zelensky had set up the Ukrainian platform to sort of reanalyze the future and rediscuss the future of Crimea. But as we know, these negotiations didn't really produce any positive results, and the leadership of Russia, President Putin, decided to recognize the independence of these two entities, the LNR and DNR in the Donbass, and to then launch a major large-scale war. As we know, a series of negotiations were engaged immediately as soon as the war broke out. They were held first in Belarus and then in Istanbul in Turkey. And again, they seem very similar to sort of issues around, I wouldn't say unconditional surrender, but they weren't really involving serious sort of exchanges and sort of concessions on both sides. Again, we were Ukrainians were faced with, as we know, the question of demilitarization, full neutrality, recognition of Russia as controlling the territories they already had occupied, besides the Donbass and Crimea, that also included the areas around Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. And at the time they occupied additional land around Kharkiv and also, as we remember, around Kiev. Another important point was the question of denazification. Now, at that time, this was not really an issue of the discussions, but it remained relevant. This idea that Ukraine had to be a country which was not really aligned with the West, but was much closer aligned to Russia. So a leadership in Ukraine, which involved close cooperation with Russia. Of course, that also involved a series of elements which were discussed earlier on around Ukrainian culture, language, and status as a sovereign nation. Essentially, what was requested from Ukraine in exchange for an end of fight was that Ukraine would have to become, in a way, sort of a kind of protectorate, a vassal state of Russia. This, of course, didn't lead very far. There's a lot of controversy as to whether the West was behind sabotage of this agreement. I'm very happy to go into the details of that and explain why it was very hard for Ukraine to accept this kind of agreement. Also, as it occurred in the context of the Bucha massacres and Irpin that were sort of coming out to the general public and to the Ukrainian public in particular. So the perception that if they handed in territory, that would be the fate of the population under Russian control. Then we move quickly. I'm going to skip sort of negotiations, which I think occurred in the winter of 2023. Very little is reported on that, but I'm happy to talk about that. But then, of course, we reached the summer of 2023 when Ukraine, when the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, comes up with his 10 points, which For our sake, we're going to focus on the question of the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And here is where I was really sort of thinking and discussing with Russians, what did they see in terms of negotiations, and what Russia would be ready to accept. This was a time when Russia was worried about the counteroffensive, that the Ukrainian counteroffensive could be more successful, that it could reach potentially Russian lines. Russia was also weakened because, as we know, there was strong opposition among the more nationalist groups against the policies of the Russian government, the insurrection of the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, Prigozhin. So I think that at the time, Russians were maybe potentially ready for what we would call, or I describe in one of my writings, as sort of meaningful concessions. The problem with this notion of concessions from the Russian point of view was that Russia was really not giving up much. It was simply accepting that Ukraine was going to become sort of anchored into sort of potentially Euro-Atlantic structure. So it would become a member of the European Union, maybe not a member of NATO, but closely aligned to NATO. Russia maybe would have been ready to withdraw from some of the occupied territories, but certainly not from Crimea and the areas of the Donbass. So this was maybe sort of a minimalist position that Russia potentially could have been ready to accept, but that for the Ukrainians was very hard to accept, because it really meant that a lot of the concessions were made from the Ukrainian side. So Ukraine had to accept that it was going to lose a significant part of its territory. And it would have been very hard to make sure that Russia didn't just take the opportunity to gain time, rearm, reshape its forces, and then launch a further operation in the future. So I think these were not really negotiations that were being discussed, but there was sort of, I think, an element to sort of assess what were the positions on all sides. What I just described of what I think were Russian meaningful concessions is not the official position, of course. This was never mentioned officially. This was an assessment and an understanding by Russian experts of how far Russia could go. As we know, this period in the summer of 2023 didn't lead to any kind of negotiations. And instead, we see by the end of the summer and by the start of the sort of the autumn and the winter of 2023-24, that Ukrainian forces sort of reach a bit of a point of what we call culmination militarily. So they're not able to breach the lines, and they're forced to start thinking about strengthening their defensive lines. And so now we find ourselves where, again, Russians have a bit the initiative, and as I was showing in my previous map, they are sort of putting pressure on many fronts on Ukraine. I think, again, they're pushing very much on the question of demilitarization, on the question of full neutrality for Ukraine, also an acceptance of sort of the status quo in terms of the areas under control. So acceptance, they always call it acceptance of the realities on the ground. They do the same with Georgia and the areas they occupy in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They repeat this argument that it is important to understand that this is the realities on the ground, and therefore very difficult to sort of give up this territory. There is also this perception that Ukrainians are going to find it very hard militarily to break the Russian lines. So sort of this idea that, you know, try to acquire as much land as possible, and in order to negotiate with Ukraine a kind of surrender of the kind that Armenia was forced, or the Armenians in Karabakh were forced to accept in 2020, November 2020, as a result of the Azerbaijani advance. and sort of a withdrawal of territories without necessarily fighting over them. And in an ideal situation, also what we call, again, the denazification, so potentially a replacement of the current leadership in Ukraine. I think these objectives remain, and I think that now Russia is has a perception that it has the initiative again, and it's going to try to push in that direction. But of course, much will depend on its capabilities to generate additional forces. But the bigger aim, and I think that is sort of the more maximalist position, and I think that's where the so-called global South, Argentina and other countries, I think are come in. And this is a question of the global aims that Russia has with this war, which go well beyond its objectives in Ukraine, and they relate above all to the desire by Russia to what we generally call this idea to reorganize the international system, to challenge the rule-based international order, to create, together with the great powers, new spheres of influence, a kind of new Yalta. I think the Soviets felt very comfortable in that situation, and I think they want to return to that reality. And to put an end to what had developed throughout the 2000s, from the mid-2000s onwards, this concept of limited sovereignty in the terms of responsibility to protect. So this notion that countries could not behave in any way sort of with their own populations, they had to be careful. And there were instruments that the UN had devised, which would limit the sovereignty of countries in terms of how they could operate with their own populations internally in terms of violations of human rights. Now, Russia intends limited sovereignty in very different ways, especially in terms of the countries around its borders. In this concept of the spheres of influence, the idea is that smaller countries have very little say and have to accept a bit that they are located in this sort of unfortunate geographical position, and therefore they may have to accept that they cannot choose their geostrategic orientation. And this may come hand in hand with growing or constant interference in the internal affairs of other states. So I think this is challenging, especially because a challenge to the rule-based international order can have many repercussions globally, and especially in countries where the frontiers have not been defined, where there are a lot of challenges around border delimitations, and when the institutions, the multilateral institutions, are no longer functioning effectively. And I think I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domitila, for sharing your insights into the broader strategic level and its implications globally. Well, we have finished listening to each of our distinguished speakers today. We are very grateful for the time and effort you have all taken to share your thoughts and insights. Thank you very much. And now we can begin our Q&A session from the audience. For those who have joined us online via Zoom, please go ahead and leave your questions in the chat. I mean, just write your question in the chat so that we can read it aloud. And please do not forget to indicate to whom the question is directed. Thank you very much. And does anyone have any questions? All right, here we have a question of Ricardo or Alexander Iskandarian. It says, in the midst of negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there are fears of an Azeri invasion of Armenia. Is this possible, and what is the likely military result of an invasion if it were to happen from an Armenian perspective? Thank you very much, Ricardo. Alexander?
This is question which is outside our topic, but I will answer with pleasure. I'm not very positive about perspectives of Armenian and Azerbaijani negotiations. I don't think that the agreement could be signed in coming times. Even if I'm mistaken, and even if some, how to call it, paper will be signed, it would be kind of, I would say, a memorandum or something like that, because the goal of Azerbaijan is not a consensual agreement and peace. The goal of Azerbaijan is continuing to push on Armenia, try to take everything possible after the military victory. And this, they are going to continue that. That doesn't mean that it will be never signed. It depends on, by the way, Ukrainian war. By how long it's going to be and what is going to be a result of that, and role of Russia, etc., etc. But at the moment, I'm not very positive about that.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Francisco, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Domitila. Has to do with Latin America now. On the one hand, if you think what are the implications for Latin America of this conflict, and then if there is a role, I'm thinking about Lula, Brazil, Milei in Argentina, in the positions of Latin American countries regarding the conflict now in Ukraine, have any importance diplomatically?
Thank you very much, Francisco. Let me start by saying, one important point, and that is that this conflict has highlighted the diplomatic relevance of countries in Latin America and more globally countries which are generally put together as the global South. I don't like at all that wording, but let's consider countries in Latin America, in Africa, and some countries, sort of smaller countries in Asia potentially, which are not so strong economically and politically. And this conflict has shown to Western countries and also to Russia of the importance of engaging with these countries, of the importance of taking into account these positions, of considering also their concerns. It has also brought to light, to attention to the Western countries, the concerns and the necessities of countries in Latin America, Global South. And therefore, I think that has had, despite the challenges of the war itself, some positive aspects, because they kind of were, they were in many ways taken for granted. I think that, as we know, initially the war very much distorted energy markets and also commodity markets, and that created great challenges for countries which were importing grain products or energy resources, and also a big challenge, which is also important to mention, was, for example, the question of fertilizers, the export of countries such as Ukraine and Russia of fertilizers. So this war had an implication. It clearly showed what was sort of the global sort of the global repercussions and the interconnectedness of the global economy. That a war far away in Ukraine from Latin America could still have an implication on sort of on global markets in energy and in commodities, especially food products and grain. So I think that this showed that even countries in Latin America and in Asia or in Africa, they also have a stake in trying to find a resolution, a positive outcome to this war. So this is really sort of the immediate implications. As I mentioned when I was finishing my presentation, I think it's also very important to highlight that to sort of in any kind of negotiations, it needs to be really highlighted very importantly how relevant it is to preserve the international rule-based order, which is often described nowadays as a kind of a liberal invention. I mean, and this is, I think it's a completely wrong understanding of it, because what we are talking here is simply that there is an understanding of upholding international law. And that is ingrained also in the UN Charter, in many UN resolutions. So I think this is an opportunity for countries in Latin America, especially weaker countries, benefit from the upholding of international law, because they do not have the capacity sometimes to change their realities through the use of force or through economic instruments. So international law generally tends to protect weaker countries, especially in terms of the security and the protection of sovereignty and internationally recognized borders. So I think that this is very important. There's been a lot of talk about whether countries in Latin America, especially Brazil, now we know that Argentina, with a new presidency, is discussing the possibility of holding potentially a sort of a summit of negotiations. I think that this is possible. I don't think it is likely. And I think that it's very important to find a neutral host. I think Brazil, which was very eager to present itself. Last summer, we had initiatives from Brazil, from Indonesia, from China. Many countries were proposing sort of mediation programs. Problem with Brazil was that Lula's president of Brazil, seemed to take a much more pro-Russian position, and that sort of created challenges with the Ukrainian side. Argentina has a possibility, generally has a tradition of the last decades of positive relations with Russia, but I'm not sure whether the Russians are going to be accepting sort of external mediation of that kind. I think the challenges are primarily related to the fact that the Americans are only interested in talking directly with the United States. And intermediaries are not really what they're interested in. So I don't think that any of these initiatives have any real meaning besides showing support. For example, in the Ukrainian case, many of these initiatives and these meetings that are taking place every, I don't know how many months, what they do show is that there is support for the Ukrainian position in terms of recognition of internationally recognized borders, so upholding international law. So it shows globally that countries are accepting, the Ukrainian position on that respect. So I think they are also important platforms, and in that respect, Latin America can play an important role. But I think that in terms of meaningful and effective negotiations that would bring an end to the war, I think that that's not going to happen through any sort of effective involvement of countries beyond those primarily involved. I mean, maybe Turkey could be an alternative.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other question? If not, I have one for, yes. Okay. I had one for you, Alexander. Just wanted to ask you something regarding what's the current situation in Chechnya and the people of Chechnya? Because they have been a major source of manpower to feed the Russian lines and the Russian war effort in the front. Of course, they have suffered a huge number of casualties. So I was wondering, what's the political climate there and what's the current situation? Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'm very sorry, but I had problems with listening what was said by Ricardo. Now I see it in written form. I understood that I answered to different question. Very short. I don't think that real wild-scale war now is possible. Escalations, yes. Military actions at the border, yes. But to imagine the real war as we have in 2020 on the territory already of internationally recognized state, Armenia is not Nagorno-Karabakh, it's different. I cannot imagine in principle everything is possible, but at the moment I don't think that it is really possible. If such kind of war will be, and Turkey will be part of that, so situation will be very dramatic for my country. Back to the question on Chechnya. You know, we need 5 more hours to talk about that. You have Russia is a very I would say you have varieties of regime inside Russia, and St. Petersburg or Moscow is one thing, Tyumen Oblast is another, so-called non-Russian republics of Caucasus are third, and Chechnya is maybe more radical example of regimes in Russia. You have a legal field in Chechnya which is different from legal field in Russia outside Chechnya. It's a kind of dictatorship. You have Russian federal law there. You have some kinds of some parts of Sharia law. For example, if you are a woman and you are state official, for example, teacher in school, or you work in kindergarten, you should go to your job with hijab. It's nonsense by Russian law, but in Chechnya it's normal. It's one person system. It's quite a consolidated authoritarianism there with some maybe some, you can call it totalitarianism in some cases. So Chechnya is very exotic regime, I would say, even on the all-Russian level. You don't have political opposition at all. You cannot have it inside Chechnya. They work at Kadyrov tried to work with Chechen diaspora in Middle East and in Europe. By the way, in Europe you have approximately about 200,000 Chechens, and they work there with these people. So situation is Chechnya is formatting state inside state. I can continue to talk about that for hours, but it's not a place for that. But Chechnya is very special, I would say, republic for Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I don't know if you can start. I think. Hear me?
Hace la pregunta y la repetimos.
So this issue was discussed in first panel, but I'm interested in the international perspective of this mandate elections in Ukraine. And although it's a domestic issue, we have heard here that there's any possibility and maybe any opinions. This is shared both by the leading party and also by the opposition. The feeling is that this war is going to go on for maybe 4 years. So the question is, what I'm wondering is, what is going to happen when when Ukraine continues to have the same government without elections? What do you think about the international community is going to tolerate or maybe to think about this situation prolonging itself for years and years, maybe? At least for inter-American international standards, this is going to be a problem from the democratic point of view. So I would like to know what both speakers think about this. Thank you.
Did you listen to the the question that Dr. Casas was posing is related to elections in Ukraine, which subject Alexei Haran referred to previously, and the impossibility of holding elections during this state of war and martial law. The question is, what happens if the war lasts for years and there's no possibility of changing the government through democratic elections in Ukraine? Would it be accepted by international community, or even if the governing party and the opposition agree to the impossibility of holding elections now, as Haran told us previously? Who would like to answer to that? Domitila?
Yeah. But if Alexander wants to add something, I'm very happy. I think that this is a very important point. I think, as was explained by Alexei, there is a certain consensus inside Ukraine that elections at this stage are very difficult to carry out, to implement. They would create also very sort of tense debate, which could be exploited. I think that the Western partners of Ukraine understand that. Also because the challenges are how do people who were living in occupied territories vote, and to what extent, if voting does not occur in those territories, you're in a way accepting that these are territories that you no longer claim to. So it has also this sort of legitimacy challenge. I think that at the moment, the international community, European countries understand perfectly well. They're working hard through the accession negotiations into the European Union to ensure that there is an institutional system that is transparent, that is fair. So they're going to exert pressure in the long run once the war is over to sort of ensure that the democratic system of Ukraine becomes more effective. But of course, the prolongation of the war is a challenge, and there is concern also inside Ukraine nowadays among certain quarters that there isn't the kind of freedom of expression and liberty that existed before. This has been expressed very clearly by the former president Petro Poroshenko, who is not being able to travel outside to meet with partners. But he has also a judicial procedure against him. So he's in a very peculiar position. But yes, there is concern also inside Ukraine. And a lot will depend on how the situation develops along the front lines. If there is a lot of movement on the front lines in either direction, so if Russia advances very fast or if Ukraine manages to break through, then there is an understanding that that's not the moment for elections. If we see in the next few years that the situation stabilizes along the front lines, the pressures for a change or for a democratic election are going to grow. And so I think that eventually it might be possible that these elections actually do take place. So I think that a lot will depend on what is the situation on the front line. And I think that the pressures for elections might grow if the situation sort of stabilizes along the front lines. But as was explained by the first speaker, this is really not the case today. There's a lot of support still for trying to modify the realities on the ground.
Thank you very much, Domitila. More questions?
Maybe Alexander wants to add it.
Alexander, would you like to add something?
No,
Okay.
I more or less agree, so nothing to add. I would agree with Domitila here.
Thank you very much. More questions? Well, I think that was the last one. So thank you very much for participating in this enriching exchange. And now, before concluding the seminar, we will listen to the closing remarks from CARI's Secretary General and Head of Eurasian Affairs Committee, Ambassador Lilia Roldan Vázquez. Lilia?
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our speakers. You've been fabulous, all of you, and so generous with your time. I would like to highlight some of the concepts that stayed with me after your presentations. And I think they are fundamental for the comprehension of this so complicated topic of Russian war on Ukraine. As Alexei Haran, our first speaker, said, this war didn't begin in 2022, but in 2014. So we are almost practically 10 years into this war now. And that is something that all of the participants, or most of them, agreed on, that this war is not just an episode, it's not something that grew out of the blue because of an impromptu from President Putin in February 2022, but it belongs to a long tradition of aggression. And I think Domitila said that Russians are in war since, or was it Tatiana? No, it was Domitila. Russians are in war since 2000 on different fronts. So this is a very long, and I would add, it's not just 2014. It started centuries before. This is a confrontation between Russia and Ukraine for centuries because of Russia's imperialist designs over Ukraine and this interest of keeping Ukraine in their power sphere. It is inconceivable for Putin, who in 2005 said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It is inconceivable to him, for him to admit that Ukraine is out of the Russian orbit of power. So this is a very central concept that I want you to retain. It is not something, a new war out of aggressions or menaces that were invoked by Russia to its security. It's a very long tragedy. And then Haran stressed the high conviction in victory in Ukrainian people. They are confident, they know it's going to be long, but they are confident that they won't stop until they recover their territories and they attain that victory that they are hoping for. He also referred to statistics, recent statistics on the confidence on government, on institutions, stressing that the highest confidence is in the military now, and then that President Zelensky has about 67%, I think he said, of confidence, which is very high considering 2 years of war, of open and very intense war in the country. And he also talked about this last question that Ignacio posed on the elections and the consensus in the society and among the political parties that elections are not possible for the time being until at least the war ends or there are some other developments, as Domitila mentioned just a few minutes ago. Then Tatiana Kostueva-Jean, who I remember she's Russian by birth and by education, said that, it was Tatiana who said that Russians are in permanent war since 2000. And that's the year when Putin came to power, if you remember. And so the Chechens war, Georgia's war in 2008, all the support to Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, and finally aggressions to Ukraine with the legal annexation of Crimea and of the eastern regions. And Tatiana gave us a good picture of a European position on the war and how Europeans were not aware of this danger before it happened. They didn't see strategically forward. They couldn't see that this was coming. Maybe some of us saw it coming, but why European governments who are next to Russia didn't see it, I can understand myself. But she also stressed that now they have reached unity and they had posed a strong reaction, a firm reaction to Russian actions, and that's optimistic for the future. Now, Russia is perceived in Europe, she said, as a risk, not only for their external frontiers, but also in their internal matters because of Russian influence on some political parties in European countries. And there's a risk of divisions fomented by Russia or Russian propaganda, as Tatiana told us. And now I thank Alexander for a concept that he gave us at the beginning of his intervention, which was that the space, the Eurasian space, is not any longer a post-Soviet space, but a post-Soviet space. That's new for me, and I really thank you, Alexander, because it is the reality today. It's not the post-Soviet space as we knew it until a few years ago. It's evolving very, very quickly and in a very dramatic way. And he also said that Russia lost its foundation of power in the region, which is very significant for the future of the region and for the future of Russia itself I think. Because if Russia loses this grasp on the region, it loses its main source of power internationally, in the international arena. It's not going to be considered a big power anymore, as it is still considered in some circles. And Alexander predicted that this loss of the foundation of power may conduct to its retreatment from the region, at least from the Caucasus or maybe the Central Asian region. That something will have to be looking forward to. And the conclusion is that Russia has politically lost internationally. Ali Maliev, who is a Tatar from origin and culture, told us about this intent of annihilating Crimean culture, Crimean language, and I was very sorry to hear about this destruction of Bakhchisarai Palace, which I visited, and it was really a gem of Crimean culture in Crimea. And it's being destroyed as part of this erasing of Crimean Tatar culture, which, you know, it's not a new thing, because in the year 1945, already all Tatars were deported from Crimea by Russia to very different places in Russia, disseminated in the territory. Now, many of them have come back to Ukraine, and they are resisting this war since from their place of residence, which is now not Crimea for most of them, but other parts of Ukraine. And he also gave a number, a figure, which is not mentioned very, very often, which is the number of Russian people from all professions that came to Crimea since the occupation in 2014. And he numbered this people in 800,000 people, which is a very, very, very high proportion of population for the peninsula. And he finished his exposition saying that the war started in Crimea and will end with the liberation of Crimea, which is the hope, I think, of every Ukrainian, Tatar or not. And then we had the pleasure and the honor to have Mrs. Matvichuk word by video message. She excused herself with me because she couldn't be on the video directly. She's traveling now, and so she sent us this video, which I think it was very rich and very moving, and the main message she passed, I think, is that this is a war not only between Russia and Ukraine, but it's a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And this is the interest for the rest of the world, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe and for the rest of the world, that this is a fight for democracy. And she also said that the war had impact on many democratic countries from different ways, but one of the ways is that they are now forced to put resources on weapons instead of putting those resources on culture and social development and other needs of these democratic countries. After this video, in our second part of the session, there was Katerina Hroshevska, who I remember was one of the people that put together the dossier that Ukraine presented to the international court and derived in the accusation of criminal and war crimes to Mr. Putin and Mrs. Maria Lvova-Belova, who is Russia's commissioner for the rights of the child. And Belova was responsible for the transfer of so many children, the forced transfer of thousands and thousands of children from Ukraine, occupied territories and not, to Russia, and she herself adopted one of these children. A Ukrainian youngster of 15 years old was taken with a group of 31 children from one establishment in Ukraine, and then adopted by Lvova-Belova 2 or 3 months later. There's another case of adoption by a Russian functionary, which is a parliamentary member of the Duma, who adopted a 2-year-old girl, also taken from an orphanage in Ukraine. So Hroshevska had a short presentation, but very powerful, and she said that children are not a collateral damage in this war, because they are specifically a target of the war. And she mentioned the word genocide, because some organs and some governments are already considering that this forced transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia enters into the dispositions of the Geneva Convention on Genocide, because it's a direct attack on the people of Ukraine and the future of the Ukrainian people. And finally, Domitila, our Argentine representative in this seminar, Domitila Sagramoso, made a very careful presentation of all the instances and efforts to negotiate an exit to this problem. Even from 2014, 2015, with the Minsk agreements, which unfortunately were not very well conducted, malgré the participation of France and Britain, and they were conducted in Belarus, if you remember, and with the participation of Russia, and they were not respected finally because they were never accepted by the Ukrainian people. For many reasons, Domitila explained these reasons very well, and then she explained the efforts during 2021 to stop this possibility of aggression by Russia, and the negotiations in Istanbul, and then Zelensky's plan of 10 points, the peace plan that President Zelensky presented last year. And none of them had results, unfortunately. And as I understand, Domitila is not very hopeful on negotiations now because of the state of things in the front, and the conviction of both Russian leaders and Ukrainian people of going on with this war for different reasons. And I'm going to stress this final argument that Domitila gave us on the limited sovereignty that Russia wants to impose on smaller neighbors, and the responsibility to protect that Russia takes on itself, you know, through passportization policy, through protecting Russians everywhere, which is in their constitution now. And so, and the final word that Domitila said, and I cannot agree more with it, is the importance of preserving the international rules order, which is being absolutely splashed by this aggression and by all the menaces that are appearing on the horizon in the international arena. So this war, and this is my final reflection, this war has been very, very damaging to the international order, to democracy in the world, and to every country which is being affected economically or in security matters by this war. And one of the worst consequences of the war, if I may, I mourn for every Ukrainian that was killed or wounded, and all of the Russians who were killed or wounded because they were sent to this war also. But I think that the tragedy, the most painful tragedy is the tragedy of children. Today, the Ukrainian government recognizes about 20,000 children that have been abducted and officially registered as lost. But some officials in Ukrainian administration speak of numbers much higher than that, that could reach 2,100. And Russia officially recognizes that they have more than 700,000 Ukrainian children in their territory. That is officially recognized in reports of Mrs. Lova-Belova Commission. So that is my final word. Please think about these children when you are thinking of this war, and let's hope it's not going to be forever. Thank you very much, Alexander, Domitila, that you stayed with us until the last minute. All other speakers had to flee because they had previous meetings and scheduled and couldn't stay with us all the time. Thank you so much for your presentations. They were wonderful and very enlightening for us. So, thank you for your presence. And thank you for all our friends that are on the other side of the Zoom, and those who have stayed with us all morning here at Gary's. Thank you.